You are here at the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance sponsored webinar on moving forward with trust and equity. I am Rachel Littman. I'm the executive director. I'm just going to start this while we wait for all the numbers to come in. We have over 300 people registered today. So I understand things can get backed up in a little bit of a bottleneck. So I'll just give a few seconds for that. Just some logistics. This program is being recorded. We will make it available within a couple of days on our YouTube channel, and we usually have emails sent out to those who participated, often with a follow-up email and survey just to find out how things were. We provide these programs to everyone as a public service, so if you like what YANA is doing, please help spread the word. Please support us. You can go to our website and see we have a big calendar there of all sorts of things coming up. And I'm going to pass this over to Ken Inadomi, our chair, in just a second, just to let everyone know the chat functions and the Q&A functions are working. If you want to communicate with the, so we're already getting some hellos there from people. If you want to chat and say hi, you can do that. If you have a specific question for the panelists, please make that clear. Otherwise, Ken will hand it to Antony Bugg-Levine, who's going to be moderated, and we'll catch up with you again at the end. Have a wonderful program.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. And I guess I should also say good evening and good morning. I understand we've got a global audience today. And because this topic is so important, I think we're very gratified to see that. Again, my name is Ken Inadomi. I'm the chair of YANA, the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance. For those of you that aren't familiar with our work, alumni-led organization. And really over the past decade, our mission hasn't wavered. It is to connect and to catalyze Yale's ever-growing social impact community and to try to leverage that for the greater good. We do that in a lot of ways, including hosting webinars like today. If you'd like to learn more, again, feel free to contact myself or Rachel or visit our website. We'd love to get you engaged. So these are certainly tumultuous times, a period of national self-examination. One thing that the pandemic has revealed is an absolutely unacceptable level of structural racism and social inequity. We're going to be doing a deep dive into that topic today, an unflinching deep dive. There's no one I can think of a thought leader more better qualified to lead this discussion than today's moderator, Antony Bugg-Levine. Anthony's been a longtime friend of YANA. He was our keynote in 2014 at our first conference. And he's the one that's responsible for pulling together this stellar group. He will introduce the rest of the panel. It's my pleasure to introduce Antony Bugg-Levine.
Thanks so much, Ken, and a real honor to be here with everyone. First of all, I just want to say it's great to see people in the chat telling us where you're from. Really exciting to know that everyone is coming in from all over. I hope everyone's healthy. I know it's been exhausting times for so many people, especially people living in and doing the work in the communities that we all serve. And so just wanted to thank everyone for taking this time. We are really aware how precious your time is. We will honor that with a commitment to a no bullshit and no acronym conversation. I think we all have felt compelled in the last few weeks, both compelled and emboldened to be more real. And I think no one exemplifies that better than the people we have on this panel today. So we thought, Ken approached me about a month ago and said, would you do something? And I said, I'm happy to talk. What I really want to do is to learn and listen from these three leaders. And so incredibly excited that the three of them committed in their busy schedules to join us today. They all did it enthusiastically at the beginning. And so just want to get to, an honest conversation about not only the work we all do. I really hope that we can talk about things that don't show up on our websites and in, our talking points. But also as people. I think part of the YANA community is about coming together as a community, and community is about who we are as people. And in different ways, we've all been challenged as family members, as leaders of our organizations, as citizens, not just on an intellectual level, but I think really on a human level in ways that none of us were prepared for. I don't care how many great books or not so great books you read in your Yale courses or elsewhere. None of us were trained for what we've gone through, and I think we're only going to get through this successfully as a community. This isn't also just a story of despair. It's also, I think, a real story of rebirth and optimism. And the conversation today is about how we move forward. We're not going to go back. We had a shift in our own organization of our own thinking, moving away from asking when are we going to go back to asking how are we going to move forward. And again, I think these panelists have done that in an exemplary way. The last thing I'll say by way of introduction is I saw a great joke on Twitter that said when people study this time and get PhDs in American history and they study this time, they'll be asked, what week do you specialize in? And I think it's certainly true that every week poses more disorienting both crises and opportunities and reveals so much about who we are and what we can become. One thing I'll say about the history of 2020 is the three panelists who are here will all be part of that history in terms of what they've been doing and leading and writing. So wanted to get into the conversation as a preamble, and to start with Crystal, and I'm not going to ask people to introduce themselves with a formal bio. You guys can read them. The bios, they certainly will draw on their own work as we have this discussion. But I wanted to begin with Crystal Hayling, who's coming to us from the Bay Area and the head of the Libra Foundation. And I put in the chat, I think we should put in the chat function a powerful, what I would call a cri de coeur. I hope you would not disagree, Crystal. That Crystal published last week about philanthropy and about the relationship between funders, the communities we serve, and a sense of urgency. So I just wanted to read a little bit of that and then have Crystal kick this conversation off by talking a little bit more about what motivated her to write that and what she sees from the amazing work that she does at the Libra Foundation. So here's what Crystal said in June. If people protesting systemic oppression are labeled thugs or terrorists for demanding their human rights, then all philanthropy's elaborate theories of change and program areas are bullshit with a bow. Apologies, we're not normally R-rated here, but the times call for it. Crystal said, we will have fiddled while the Constitution burned. Please, please do not talk to me now about the importance of future funding for that after-school tutoring program you love. That is an insult to the gravity of this moment. It is a breach of the values your foundation says it upholds. It is an insult to the ideal of the person you say you are. And later on, she says, literally everything in this country has changed in the last 6 months, and so must your foundation. Crystal, that's heavy. Help us understand what brought you to that point. And you talk in the piece about this country being on a precipice. I know you are not going to stop fighting until we are pulled back. Tell us about what that means for you and your work.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having us. This conversation was one I jumped at because it is wonderful to be in this community and to dip back into the Yale experience of trying to have open and honest conversations about hard topics. You know, I have to say, I found that piece, I found it really hard to write. Because one of the things that you learn coming out, I come from a family without a lot of means, daughter of a civil rights activist, got to Yale, had no idea what to expect of that experience, and realized that I was being given some opportunity to live and function in rare air. That I was being given some privilege that allowed me to have conversations that lots of other people from my community aren't able to have. And so I became kind of a bridge, you know, a translator, somebody who could do that work. And what I found is what the protests have really brought for me is a question of what is that fine line between being a bridge and being in collusion? And being in collusion is really about saying that you are putting down the needs of your community and you are accepting the desires of the people who are in power. And that is really what I think a lot of people in philanthropy, particularly people of color, are saying we're not going to do anymore. And what it really means is saying we're going to talk about the fact that there is anti-Black racism that exists in all of these organizations, that philanthropy is a white space that does not really allow for our voices, and that we actually have to work really hard to make sure that we speak up, that we talk about funding Black-led organizing, that we talk about what it means to fund organizations that don't look like the typical acceptable grantees. And we know exactly what those organizations are, right? You know, those are the organizations where the minute you bring them up, somebody in the room says, but do they have the capacity to accept the big grant? You know, when we start talking about Black-led organizing and groups that are led by and for people of color, which is what we try to fund at Libra, people say, but what's the pipeline really look like? So we know all the language that gets raised that tries to stop us and prevent us from doing this work. And I think what's happening now is that more and more people are saying we really have to fund organizations led by and for people most impacted by the issues because they have the solutions. We actually have to bring the voices of people of color who are in philanthropy more to the fore and allow them to be able to help set up and establish some of the directions that we need to go. And we actually have to enter into this philanthropy with a learner's mind. We have so much of an assumption that we have the solutions and we are sprinkling them along with grant dollars down into communities that don't have money and resources and don't have knowledge. Fact of the matter is those communities have a lot of knowledge. What they need is a partnership with those resources with us. And we have to enter into those relationships, bringing those resources, but being in partnership and listening and learning together. So I'll just stop there and say that's where I think.
That's great. I actually wanted to pick up on that before we turn to Nikki. You know, I often think that the challenge in both living in this time and in leadership is to maintain a balance between outrage and optimism. And I was really struck in one of our work at Nonprofit Finance Fund, we got to be down in Texas with an inspiring leader named Michael Sorrell, who's the head of an HBCU outside Dallas. And listening to him speak, I was really struck by how charismatic he was. And it made me realize that charisma from him, and then I thought about the people who are my own heroes, whether it's Nelson Mandela, who I got to work with, or Dr. King, they kept that balance. They were outraged and yet were able to maintain optimism. And if you lack either one of them, then your leadership's either inauthentic or ultimately paralyzing. There's clearly no lack of reason to be outraged. And your piece gets that in a very visceral way. Where do you get your optimism? And is it from the incredible, I'm inspired by your grantees who are just amazing community leaders, but how do you keep that balance?
Well, I absolutely get it there. And one of the things that I think is you touch on such an important point. We don't typically allow outrage in philanthropy. Everything needs to be very even, very calm, very rational. And a lot of us are outraged. And I'm thinking right now about Nick Tilson, who is the founder of NDN Collective, who's just been released from jail. Arrested trying to protest against this president going to Mount Rushmore, making sacred tribal lands into a backdrop for a very dangerous gathering that he did on the 4th of July. And I think about those protesters saying, we will not allow you to come here and make our sacred lands into sort of a backdrop for your story that is really about hatred and really undermining what is the democracy of this country. And that to me is both powerful. It is also an expression of rage, but it is also an expression of the beauty of what it is that they are standing for and what they are offering our country and what they are actually offering in terms of what they believe in. So to me, I'm listening to these organizations. I think about someone like Latasha Brown, who is one of the co-founders of Black Voters Matter, who is, has got the Black Voters Matter bus that is driving around the South, talking to people, playing music, listening to, people's concerns, and encouraging people to participate in the electoral process. There is an incredible beauty that is happening here when we fund community-based organizations with general operating support dollars, when we fund them with long-term relationships and we say we're going to fund you over years, not just one episodic programmatic grant. What people do is they build community and they build a way of talking to each other. They build culture. That is actually what I find inspiring, right? So it's not just little teeny tiny programs here and there, but it's really a radical imagination, as Angela Glover Blackwell talks about, of what freedom looks like, of what a country in which we care for each other looks like. So that gives me tremendous hope because I find these organizations often are very much right in the middle of anger and outrage and very much in the midst of creating beauty and hope. And so that's what I look to.
That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's also a great lead into Nikki. And you've had a long career in philanthropy and in the social sector. You conceived a program a few years ago that was really premised on the idea that we can actually build a more just and vibrant society if we can come together across lots of lines of division. And I think you run an amazing fellowship program that is premised on the idea that bring someone who was a victim of police violence alongside a police chief in open and intimate discussions, and that's how we can forge the country we want to live in. Would love for you to talk more about that work. And you didn't know what was going to happen with the uprisings or COVID or the isolation when you conceived the program. And so how has that work changed? And do you still have faith in that premise?
Well, first of all, let me say thanks to you, Antony, and to YANA. It's always great to have a reason to reconnect with Yale and to spend time with my friend Crystal. She and I got a chance to be in Montgomery at the opening of Bryan Stevenson's National Memorial for Peace and Justice just a few years ago. And when you ask about optimism versus outrage, I think that's a perfect example of channeling outrage into an optimistic, fact-based expression of truth for this country to look in a mirror. As it relates to the Civil Society Fellowship, which is a partnership of the Anti-Defamation League and the Aspen Institute, we have welcomed 21 inaugural fellows into this fellowship. And when Jonathan Greenblatt and I, Jonathan who leads ADL, when we first started talking about this notion, we were hearkening back to the civil rights movement. We were thinking about the marital equality movement. We were thinking about the women's movement. We were thinking about all this history and hoping that we could attract next generation leaders of differing ideologies to come into a space to talk about how to regain balance in civil discourse. We had no idea what was right around the corner, as you said, Antony. And to now look at these fellows and listen to them respond to this pandemic. I'm thinking about one who works in the King County, Seattle government, the first transgender appointee leader within a federal administration, the Obama administration, who saw the pandemic in its earliest days and was in the trench there responding before we had any idea about how to flatten a curve. Would we flatten a curve? And still, is in that fight. I'm thinking about the fellows you just mentioned, Police Chief of Lynchburg, Virginia, who last week sat on a webinar with another fellow who is a criminal justice advocate who himself spent a decade in New York State prisons, and for the 10 years since being released has been a phenomenal voice in advocacy and restorative justice and has a wonderful podcast. I'm thinking about a fellow who is a member of the Northern Cheyenne Nation, who is an architect actually with the group that designed Bryan Stevenson's memorial, who right now is working to create communities to respond to COVID that, despite the need to isolate and shelter, create communal space for healing, something that's so important to any human being, but certainly in our Native Indigenous communities. So these are the people who help me balance my outrage because they don't have time to just stay stuck in the outrage. They are out there doing the work, and they're making me stronger and better while being more optimistic.
And let me actually shift to Noel, and then I'll come back to you on that point about optimism. Noel, obviously, the work that Nikki and Crystal do is focused around social justice and civil rights and government. You are, and have been for many years, one of the leaders in the work to build a more equitable wealth in our country, especially in the Latinx community that your organization serves. How do you see in your work the link between the social justice and the civil rights struggle that has sort of reappeared to prominence and the longstanding work that you and others have been doing around wealth creation and closing the wealth gap?
Yeah, and It's a privilege to be on this thing. Thinking a lot about privilege. This is one kind. I love it. And you know, I've got the privilege of working with hundreds of organizations across the country that focus on these issues of neighborhood development and building financial capability in low wealth communities, and you know, small business development, all these issues. I guess two different ways that I think about it. You know, one is this question of what are the foundations for wealth building, right? What are the foundations on which we build economic mobility? And fundamental to that is, you know, one, civil rights, right? The right to be able to move unfettered through the streets, through the economy. And so you know, how many examples do we have in our friends and our lives on TV of a young person on a positive trajectory who has an encounter with law enforcement that is unjust, and that encounter derails decades of wealth building potential, right? That happens all the time, right? And so the idea that you can't build wealth without that basic foundation. The other part of that basic foundation is just, you know, basic human needs. Hunger. If you are hungry, you are not building wealth. You know, if you do not have stable housing, right, you are not. It's a basic healthcare, right? So these sorts of things. So there is this sort of interrelatedness to the point that you cannot pull them apart between all of these issues. That's one thing that I think is fundamental. And the other, I guess, is I love the idea of thinking about this work in tensions, you know, between two poles, right? And this sort of big picture of where of our rights and where we want to go as a society is incredibly important for us to hold in one hand. But then, you know, most of the people that our network serves are immigrants or the children of immigrants who are not aspiring necessarily in their day-to-day to even economic equality, right? I just want my shot. I just want to be able to feed my kids, God willing to send them to an educational path that will open up this country to them, right? And those are sort of much more basic concerns, and I relate to them very deeply. As the child of an immigrant, that if we're not delivering the here and now, right, the thing that you really want today, how then do we make this leap to a greater country, right? So, I mean, I guess those are things that I think about a lot in sort of balancing. So why this approach, and how does it fit with what's going on in this country and this sort of thing? I'll stop there.
And just, you know, just to stay on that, you know, your work, you're in Texas, you're working in a community that has been very visibly under threat for a few years, not just a few months. I mean, I think a lot of communities have been in trauma for much longer than the mainstream media has been covering, and that's certainly true. But I mean, how have, again, for you and the work you do, lots of reasons to be outraged the last few years and to lose hope. What drives you? What motivates you, you know, over the years to keep doing what you do? And how has that shifted in the last few months as more and more people are just becoming more, you know, visible around these issues?
You know, I think there's something, if you're in this game for a long time, right, you have to care for your mind and for your soul to make sure that you are not, you're not sort of internalizing trauma, right? And so I think, you know, I've had a really interesting conversation with our own staff, and particularly young people on our staff, that really revealed to me, held up a mirror to me about the kind of, I hate to use the metaphor, but kind of wartime mentality that I'm in and have been in for a long time. When the Trump administration came in, look, lots of undocumented people, that's who we serve, right? And so I knew what the deal was. They were real clear about it, right? And it was the one thing that they were fully prepared to do on day one. They were prepared to do almost nothing on day one, but going after undocumented folks and low-income Latinos and immigrants from all over this world was something they were ready to do, right? And so we knew this. And so it's like, you know, you kind of put on the hockey mask and you just put up your dukes and you go after it, right? You do what you can to minimize harm, to save lives. And so being at the center of a Latino serving network, and particularly low income and immigrant, I can't tell you how many stories have funneled to me that I would prefer not to hear. And so if you have been in, the work of addressing, police violence, like, you have heard so many stories. And so there's something great about the way in which many of these issues have been forced to the fore and have been brought up and are talked about so much in media and are on platforms. And that's really important. But you do have to be, I think, a little careful about not showing too much of that jadedness to a lot of people who are coming into the movement and are very important to the movement moving forward. And so I do feel this sense of optimism about the not going backness of all of this. I think there's something real there. I think there's been a lot of questions about that. I think there's something very real there. But I have to say, it requires me to look in the mirror and say, get your head up, speak out on these things in clear ways. Don't keep your head in a trench. Just fighting that fight, right? Because then you miss the opportunity to do something greater. So I'm not sure that's terribly articulate, but you did invite us getting into our own heads a little bit, and that's where I've been living is this sort of make sure you're not so consumed by the violence and the terrible things that are happening, to not be sharp on the opportunity, because it will come and it may pass by, and it is on us to grab it, and run with it.
That's great. This is exactly where I wanted to go. When we talked about this earlier, this is a traumatic time with a lot of horrible things happening and tension, but there are these windows opening of just, for me, it was, we set up what now became a $37 million zero interest loan fund in New York City to support nonprofit human services and arts organizations in 9 days. And I worked with the team from the Ford Foundation and one of my inspiring mentors, Darren Walker. It's the second largest investment like that they've made in 51 years of doing it. And 9 days, they've never counted a deal like that in weeks, yet alone days. And that just revealed to me what is possible when we operate with a sense of urgency. And Crystal, despite the obvious failure for all the funders to respond in an adequate way, I mean, you guys responding by massively increasing your funding, other organizations doing it, I just got inspired by this window that we can do these things. And if we could do that in 9 days, what else could we do in 9 days? And so I have a bit of survivor's guilt, because on one level, it's very traumatic. On the other hand, I've been exhilarated by what's been possible and what's been shown to be possible. So I'd love to hear from any of you. I'm not going to direct it. What do you now believe is possible? Not just on the negative side, but on the positive side. For those of us who want to go forward in a way that's more inclusive and just, what do you now believe is possible that you did not believe on February 1st, 2020? And what has led to that belief?
I remember senior year at Yale, sleeping on the lawn in front of Woodbridge Hall, president's office, protesting apartheid. And I really believed then that Nelson Mandela would never be free, that apartheid would never end. And when I saw him walk free a few years later, I stopped using the word never. And so I feel we're in another one of those moments where so much is possible. And I noticed someone asked in the chat about reparations. And I would say, through efforts like the late John Conyers and Ta-Nehisi Coates more recently, talking about even just studying reparations. Well, California now has a plan to put looking at reparations on the November ballot. And so here we are talking about the thing that many of us thought could never happen. Well, we know it's happened. Japanese Americans had some reparation after being interned after Pearl Harbor. Victims of Chicago torture, African American men, brutalized in the hands of the Chicago police during the 1970s, not so long ago, have had reparations. So we know this country can do it. When you look at George Floyd die at the hands of a sworn officer who's a member of our government, and you feel the ghost of enslavement in that moment, I believe we gotta like vacate the haunted house of this country and face our ghost. And one way to do that would be through truth telling, reconciliation, and some type of repair work. I think it's possible.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Nikki. I'll jump in. We have seen what has now become, in these protests, the largest social movement in the history of this country. Many, many, many people of all ethnicities are carrying signs that say Black Lives Matter. When the Black Lives Matter movement was created out of Ferguson, most people in this country had a negative response to the phrase. We have seen that take many years to change over time. And yet, out of these protests, defund the police as a phrase came up. And honestly, 3 weeks ago, I was having huge debates with many white liberal friends who were saying, the marketing thing is, you don't want that kind of a phrase. It's not good. This is the wrong thing. A poll has just come out showing that over 70% of Americans understand that the concept of defund the police means taking money out of the police force because it's not well equipped to provide for mental health services, for homeless services, for educational services, and taking that money and putting it into those services that communities need. People understand that. It's a phrase that, a month ago, people thought was some radical, crazy thing that was inciting violence. And now I think a lot of people are saying, this is the conversation we actually need to be having. So I think that we have underestimated, there's a concept that we're always, sort of folks who believe in kind of a progressive and liberal politics are always trying to run to the center instead of trying to move the center. And I think we've now got an understanding that we have to be doing that. We have to be moving the center because we have for too long accepted that all we could do was do these sort of little, accept breadcrumbs on the edges of real change. I think we understand too, I completely agree with Nikki that we're at a moment in which having conversations about what our actual history is, as opposed to the history we've been taught. Our board went to the Peace and Justice Museum, and really because we do criminal justice reform, it was essential that we understand that through line from slavery to Jim Crow to now in terms of police and the carceral system. So that was really important to understand, and that's not a history most of us grew up with. So I think we're at this moment where we can really have an understanding and a conversation. We talk to organizations like the Texas Organizing Project, like Mi Gente, that are grantees that are saying to us, we actually have to have a real conversation about what a border is, about who's legal and who's not. These are real conversations that we're beginning to have, I think, through Noel and others who've been working on these issues for so long. This is a moment that we need to open up and crack open. And I just want to say one other thing too, just back to the issue of hope. The other thing that this movement and so many of the young people right now, particularly in the Black Lives Matter movement, are teaching us is we also have to have a focus on healing justice. Healing justice means that we have to acknowledge the harm that has been done, and we have to do the work to repair that harm, right? That's the core of reparations. But it is an emotional and soulful reparations and repair as well that we have to go through as a country. And that's a process. That's work that we're doing, and we have to invest in that too.
So I want to pick up on that point, because I think too often this critical looking at our past, this process of truth and reconciliation that our country needs and has not done is viewed as a backwards looking activity. Well, maybe that was my ancestors. That wasn't me. That's the classic response, right? And And this idea that to move forward, you need that, right? And so all of these things that are looked at as sort of defund the police, right? Defund the police is actually based on really well-documented, well-researched, really logical approaches that have come up out of the streets and out of good research and out of all these sorts of things, right? And it's an entirely logical way of talking about maintaining order in a diverse society, right? And yet, it can be very easily characterized or caricatured, right, without an understanding of where are we coming from here, right? What is this system based on? And so, I mean, just as the UN has supported truth and reconciliation in so many places that seem so far away to Americans, boy, terrible things happened there. And that's a terrible process they're having to go through. Our country needs that help, right? And I think ultimately moving forward, that also reframes a conversation about capital, about how capital flows in our society, right? Because that, from my perspective, is one of those absolutely top level things that reinforces all of this systemic problem, right? And it's very interesting to me. You asked the question, Antony, about sort of what did you not think was possible, a few months ago that could be. The Federal Reserve has created these Main Street facilities for investing capital, and the conversation has gone increasingly deeper and deeper into the economy. 2 years ago, the idea that the Federal Reserve would think about anything but the liquidity for the largest, capital movers in our system was ridiculous, was laugh you out of a room, right? And we've got a chairman, ironically, appointed by Trump, who is really driving the sort of role of the Federal Reserve into thinking much, much deeper into our economy. What if our community development finance system, what if all of these systems for moving capital in real ways in the most vulnerable and hardest places to move capital in our society actually got access to the essentially unlimited capital that the Federal Reserve can make available? What if?
I hope I'm not speaking out of turn to say that those conversations are happening. That's not speculative. And they are happening because people at the Fed were confronted by their own sense that they don't want the legacy of their current work to be what happened in the 1930s, when well-intentioned white technocrats set up an entire infrastructure to stabilize the economy and build what became the middle class through housing, and has as a legacy redlining. And that has been very salient within some of the Federal Reserve banks, that it's not a legacy people want. So I guess it goes back to the point about teaching history as well. Please do, those of you who are listening in, if you have questions, drop that in the Q&A. We are going to take time in a few minutes to do that. But one of you mentioned the idea of, the importance of looking back as a way to move forward. And so on a bit of a personal basis, if you could invent a time machine and get in the time machine and, land it somewhere near the center of New Haven, Connecticut on the day that you graduated from Yale, and come up with, I don't know what your scene was, you probably had a lot of family, but if you could secret your 21, 22-year-old self away, what would you tell about this work, about the future, what you think is possible? What do you wish you knew then that you know now?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Nikki.
And this actually kind of goes to a point Noel made a minute ago about thinking these ugly moments in this country were so long ago. I just want to, if you guys can see this picture, that's me, 8 years old, with my grandma standing in her driveway. She was born in 1892, which means her parents were enslaved. They were enslaved. It's really not that long ago. And when I think about this, when I look at her, I feel it like it was yesterday. And so, Antony, your great question about the Nikki in 1985 when I graduated from Yale, what I wish I knew then that I know now is that it's a long game. And as optimistic as I was that day, I would want her to know that she's got to stay healthy. She's got to have mentors. She's got to stay mindful. And she's got to know that the fight is going to be a long fight. And so, 1985, it was my 35th reunion this year, which couldn't go to because of the pandemic. I want her to know that, a scourge like this would be possible, and to think about how to be prepared and what my role in this recovery can and should look like.
When I was, Nikki, you talked about the divestment work that you did when you were at Yale around apartheid, and just not so many years later, there were those of us who landed in the middle of a union struggle at Yale, and I remember the president of the university ordering me and a group of people arrested for protesting the approach, this sort of union busting approach that we saw in the university's response. And I remember on right around graduation that weekend, there was a reception in the president's office, or in his house, and I remember him taking a look at me, and I remember not saying anything to him. And I think one of the things that I had to shake off from the Yale experience was that I think I came in with a pretty clear sense of right and wrong, of justice. And I think I left with a lot of caution about where that could get you in this world. And it's taken me a career to shake that off, right? And to be willing to walk up to that man in his home, in his glory of sending off another graduating class and victory, to say, there were ways in which you went about this that were not victorious, that in fact were corrosive in what you taught, because so much power walks out of the door of Yale, right? And it occurred to me to say something like that, and then it immediately occurred to me to not say that. And so I think if I went back, I would say to that young man, open your damn mouth, kid. Don't sweat it. Just say what you got to say, the thought.
Wow, I love that. Thank you, both of you. Yeah, I think I too would, I have two thoughts about that, building off of both of those. I think I did not give enough credit. I was there with my parents, and I always have, I of course love my parents and respect them as a true Southern girl, but I don't think I really studied their lives for the lessons that I could learn. And I don't think I really gave enough credence to the knowledge that they had. So, and my grandparents, my father was a civil rights activist, and when he, after the Klan shot up our house and drove us out of town, right? We just got run out of town. My father had to move in his mid-30s with 3 small children to a new city and set up his dental practice all over again. So to your comment, Noel, about capital, right? What does it mean to have your entire livelihood destroyed as an adult and have to start over again as an adult, economically, right? And spiritually. And that was sort of history that I knew, but I don't think I really had internalized what that meant and what fortitude and strength I had been lucky enough to have in my family, and really take that in deeply. I think also to the point of really understanding that power concedes nothing without a demand. I think that there is a sense that we have to, that friendship and connection is the only way that we see progress. It is one way that we see progress, and many of the relationships that we built at Yale have resulted in connections professionally and other things that have allowed me to do the work that I do. But there is a need for confrontation. There is a need for demands. And I think I undervalued that in my younger years. And I think I appreciate it much more now.
Wow. Thank you guys so much. It's not lost on me that when we talk about history and what's possible, none of the four of us would have been welcome at Yale not that long ago. And you guys really are the best of us. So I just want to switch. We got more questions than we can answer. Lots of really interesting one, including one from my board chair, who some of you know, so I probably have to get to that one out of own professional survival. But before we get to, I won't make you first, Henry, but we've gotten a few questions. I've been trying to keep up with the chat. And, you know, Crystal, you did reference that a lot of the optimism is coming from the fact that there's a new generation stepping up to leadership. And while I think the diversity of this panel is exemplary, we aren't that diverse age-wise, and it's really important that we, you know, recognize that. I think next time, let's do this again, and we'll bring in some of those young leaders. In the meantime, how do you all see generational shifts being part of what is driving both the disruption of the last few months as well as some of your own optimism? And I know, you know, Nikki, you've got young people in your fellowship. Noel works with a lot. Crystal, your grantees. Do you guys think there's something happening here that's about letting a new generation lead? And then what is the role for those of us who have the privilege you talked about and the command of resources to support them, not just the four of us, but the people who are listening in as well? What could we be doing to support those guys to take this to the next level?
I'll start by saying I am so inspired by the next generations. I look at my nieces and nephews, and I think about being able to graduate from a place like Yale with only $11,000 of debt, which at the time sounded like Mount Everest. But now the heaps of the tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars that if you go to college, as Noel referenced, you're lucky enough to have this privilege. They have nothing to lose. They have nothing to lose, I feel. And so getting out into the streets, even risking their health, feels like a rational choice. And I feel like my obligation is to listen, to empower, to fund, and you know, to do my best to leave this place better than I found it.
You know, I think there's something absolutely fundamental about that question, Anthony. You know, I think our civil rights movements missed an opportunity over time. Doing, you know, we stand on people's shoulders and have done so much, right? But there was a leadership model in many organizations that was about get behind one leader, right? And I think our generation in some ways began to confront that. But I think now we are seeing that happening radically differently. And I am so excited about that, because I think that's the path to building capacity faster, to innovation, to all of these wonderful things, right? And I am also really, something that gets me optimistic, right, is hearing the level of sophistication when somebody shoves a microphone in some random kid's face on the street, right? Some like CNN reporter walks up and throws a microphone in their face, and they just break down like a thesis on the future of our country and how to get there. Hey, how old are you? Like, what are you, a plant? You know? And so I think there is this extent to which the sophistication on our streets today, and I don't know this for sure, this is my gut, is in a different place than it was, you know, 50 or 60 years ago in our country. And that fear that this kid had at a time, right, is not there in the same way. And that excites me a ton. And if we're not investing in that, what the hell are we doing, you know?
couldn't agree more. And I think that you're exactly right. But it's true, too, that social movements have almost always been led by young people. You know, there is a misunderstanding, too, of the civil rights movement in the South, that it was just Dr. King. And the reality is it was a lot of young people who got out in the streets who, you know, whether it was from SNCC, you know, that they said, listen, we don't understand. And they said it to their, you know, church going elders. We don't understand how you are going to, how you've been taking it for this long, and we're not going to anymore. They were the ones sitting at the counters, you know, demanding things. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And it's just incredibly exciting because they have a deep analysis, and they have a willingness to talk about race in a way that our generation was taught to gloss over race. And say, let's just talk about the economics, or let's just focus on education, or let, you know, they're like saying, no, no, no. There is something radically different that happens to me and my experience in this country based on the perceptions others have of my race and what that means about who I am. And so I completely agree. I think we are seeing young people stepping up in a way that the supports that we need to provide to them continue to support them, encourage their leadership, step aside. Some of us need to do that. And that's a really important skill for some of us who've been leading for a long time to get and to understand. And I think that that's really, you know, long-term support. Somebody asked in here, what do we need to do? Financial resources are important. It's got to be long-term. It's got to be general operating. It's got to be with a trust that they know what they're doing. It's got to be the full inclusivity of what they want to do and their vision. Those are the kinds of things that I think people really need who are out on the streets right now. And they're building a movement, not a moment. And we've got to be there to support them.
That's great. And, you know, we're talking about them. I noticed on the chat, we've got a few people who are recent graduates of Yale who I would assume are part of that younger group. And I just say personally, you know, get in touch with me personally, find me on LinkedIn, send me a link. I'd love to connect with you guys and see if my organization can be helpful as well. Just one thing I could offer coming out of this. We only have a few more minutes left. And I mentioned we have got a few questions, not just from my board chair, but from others. And we don't have enough time, but I'd like to cluster them into just one quick round final thought from you all. A few people have said, you know, this is fine. You know, Crystal, you talked about funders opening up their coffers, finding new kinds of grantees. You know, Nikki, you talked about the work that some of your panels are doing, and Noel, what it's going to take to really build long-term sustainable, resilient wealth in a more equitable way in our communities. A few people have said, well, that's all well and good, but aren't you just saying we're going to perfect old ways of working that just don't work? So what are do you guys agree that we don't need to just tweak current systems that fundamentally reimagines the systems we're in? And I know this is unrealistic to do in a few minutes, but you know, if there's one major system that you see constraining our future, you talked, Noel, about capital markets. Are there others? You know, one thing you would want to see radically changed that you believe there's a pathway in our lifetimes to actually making happen? Would love to hear that from you guys.
So I'll say that I'm someone who lived as a kid in a communist country. I've seen sort of what misused socialism does, right? And so I have a deep and abiding skepticism of tear down our economic system. That being said, I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that we are in a moment like after the Great Depression. And I'm not comparing the depth or what have you, but the idea that our economic system is imploding right now. And if we don't find, and the primary way in which that's happening is around wealth disparities, right? And income disparities. That's our I think our best metric for this. And so if we don't radically change the system, and I'm not saying burn it all down, but really change how capital flows through our system, we are going to end up with a very, very problematic situation, right? And I do think that those changes are realistic, and they are not blowing up capitalism, right? But boy, radically different capital flow is where I go with that.
I'll take.
Go ahead, Nikki.
We'll give you the last word, Crystal. You're just gonna light us all up. I'll take the baton from Noel and say, you know, when we were listening to Andrew Yang in those first debates, who of you out there believed you'd see universal basic income happening within a year? So to the point of this pandemic, like really revolutionizing everything. And let's agree that a check for $1,200 is not going to be sufficient to really radically shift what's needed in this country. But it gives you that tiny glimmer that a mindset shift is beginning. And that's another thing that gives me hope. And I want to cite Edgar Villanueva, who many of us know in philanthropy as a dissenting voice and a kind of a challenging voice. He wrote a book called Decolonizing Wealth. And if you haven't read it, you got to get with it, because he wants us to look at money as medicine, to get out of our colonized mindsets. And I'll just wrap up my comment by quoting one of our fellows who lives in Appalachia, 30 years old, among the youngest of our fellows, who last week said, "My queerness had blinded me to my whiteness." And in her example, I see someone who's able to square away identities in a way that are not at odds with each other, a more communal mindset. And that's the revolution that I think we all need to get on board with. So thank you.
So Crystal, bring us home.
Well, I mean, I think the radical imagination is exactly where it's kind of where we started, and it's where we go, you know, because let's be honest that when Noel says that our economic system is imploding, that's actually right. We fund environmental justice work, and we throw around the phrase sustainability. But the reality is a system that is based on extracting beyond the capacity of the system is unsustainable, which means it will stop. It will not keep going. That's what's happening, right? We are seeing that there are, you know, when we talk about what the horrific abuses of human rights, you know, I took my 14-year-old son to Standing Rock, and we saw where the pipeline was originally scheduled to go. And then when they decided to run it through native lands, because the white people in the place where it was originally destined to go said no. And this whole question of, if our relationship to the land is not questioned and our stewardship of resources is not put in right relation, we're never going to get out of this, right? We can't continue to have a system that says we're going to extract from our land and from our planet resources that we cannot replenish. And then we're going to require that the communities that we deem to be less human, the Black and brown communities, are the communities that have to ingest that inequality, right? The phrase, "I can't breathe," is an environmental justice phrase too, right? We have to become in right relation to this planet. That's what's happening here. That's the radical change that has to happen, because that's how we transform our economy and make it more equitable, more communal, more about, you know, the Economist had the cover story that said there's this frightening divide happening between Main Street and Wall Street, right? The economy actually is not a phrase people use to have anything to do with human people, right? It's about something else, right? But we need to be talking about humans. What's the purpose of the economy? The economy is for us to have a community and a society that serves us all, right? That allows us to all be fully human. And I think that's where we're headed. And that's what's possible right now. And I am so excited that I get to be in relationship with people like you guys, and that people, you know, that participants in YANA are interested in these conversations and pushing this work, because we have to imagine that we can build a better society. And that's where we're headed.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I have nothing to add other than it's been really inspiring. I do believe when I listen to people like you and the people that you guys all work with that we cannot succeed. There's a moral imperative to succeed, but there's also just this incredible strength in what you all do and what you represent, backed up by your communities and your history and your people. And I defy the pessimists to believe that this can be suppressed. So thank you guys so much. It's been inspiring and really rejuvenating to hear you all. And let's do this again a year from now and ask ourselves what we think a year from now that we didn't know was coming.
That's right. Anthony, thank you so much for the great questions. Thank you.
And thank you so much to YANA and Ken. I think of Ken as a quintessential network weaver, tireless in bringing people together. And it really is such an essential service that I think too seldomly gets recognized. So to Ken and to Rachel and YANA, thank you guys so much for organizing this and for everyone joining us. Look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Peace.